It's been revealed that Liberal MP Bridget Archer was called into a meeting with her boss, the Prime Minister, shortly after she crossed the floor in support of a bill put forward by Independent MP Helen Haines last week. Scott Morrison has described the gathering, which was also attended by Josh Frydenberg and Maurice Payne, as a, quote, very warm, friendly and supportive meeting. But speaking to The Guardian, Ms Archer said it was a frank discussion, not just a pastoral care meeting, and one she would have preferred not to have in the heat of the moment. Ms Archer was one of a number of coalition MPs who crossed the floor to vote against the government last week. Now, this incident has reignited an ongoing conversation over the treatment of women in Parliament. It's been 4 years since the MeToo movement emerged, and this year it arrived in the halls of power with Brittany Higgins' allegation she was raped in Parliament House, followed by a litany of claims of harassment and bullying. Now, the significance of this movement, the changes it's brought and the work still ahead is the subject of the latest quarterly essay by award-winning journalist and author Jess Hill, who joins us now. Welcome back to The Drum.
Thanks, Julia.
Now, the reckoning, you've called it, how MeToo is changing Australia. Has the MeToo movement succeeded in change in Australia, and what is the measure of success here?
That's a really good question. It's not that it has succeeded, but that it has had a really seismic impact. And I think that if we look back over the last 4 years, we have for the majority of that time had a federal government that's been pretty antagonistic to feminist issues. I think I could put that mildly. But in the year or so after MeToo went viral, we had an openly feminist Prime Minister heading a Conservative government in Malcolm Turnbull. And in that time, Kelly O'Dwyer, his Minister for Women, commissioned the Respect at Work inquiry, which is absolutely world-leading, and had in its recommendations the central recommendation to enforce a positive duty on employers to prevent sexual harassment, which would make sexual harassment equivalent to a workplace health and safety issue. That is revolutionary in its promise to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace. Obviously, right now we have a government that's not pushing forward with that, but we've also had the Dyson Heydon allegations that was investigated by the High Court, an inquiry that was headed up or that was instigated by the first female High Court Chief Justice, Susan Kiefel, that has now set an example for all of the courts. Josh Bornstein, who's an employment lawyer, represented a number of the associates who alleged against Dyson Heydon. He now has cases with 5 different judges in 5 different courts, and he says they're falling over themselves to respond properly. And he describes it as a cultural revolution happening in the courts. And then, of course, as you say, we've come to this year, we've had a citizen-led insurgency against the Morrison government that has circulated around sexual violence. We have had Chanel Contos's incredible world-shaking petition that showed just what a rape culture we are living in Australia. And we had everything from Sony Music to the mining industry absolutely explode with allegations against men who were, especially in the music industry, formerly untouchable. So when I say it's had a seismic impact on Australia, I think it's easy to poo-poo a movement like MeToo and just sort of see it, we didn't get enough powerful scalps, but the change has been tectonic.
Yeah, onto that powerful scalps thing, I was really interested to read. Now, of course, the idea of a reckoning implies an avenging and a punishing, a consequences. As you've said, this was a movement of accountability. Yet you argue towards the end of your essay that it perhaps could have been a good thing, strangely, that there weren't so many high-profile scalps in Australia. Tell us about that.
So in Australia, as different to America, we don't have the same kind of culture of transparency. In fact, our national identity, a lot of it revolves around mateship. And one of the central tenets of mateship is loyalty to your mates above the law. And the effect of that, aside from all the positive virtues of mateship, is the erasure of sexual violence. And we have a very almost instinctive way of recoiling from allegations of sexual violence. Now, had we had dozens and dozens of powerful scalps, even at a per capita level compared to the United States, I think that the change would have been seen as too fast, too furious, too threatening. And I think the movement may have been derailed by that. What Tarana Burke, who founded MeToo, a separate movement in 2007 to the hashtag, her whole thing was about structural change. That actually she saw Scalps as kind of counterproductive to her movement. I think they're a wonderful symbiosis. Scalps provide a touchstone. They show that powerful men will not act with impunity. But the structural change is what is necessary to make those normative changes stick.
And of course, there was a lot of discussion, Ashley, about the fact that Tarana Burke had, you know, been working for many, many years of advocacy and community work, and then suddenly, you know, some powerful white celebrities took it up, and it became a cause celeb around the world. And it's been good to see Tarana Burke being recognised kind of globally as the true founder of the movement. But I think the fundamental question in Australia, given the origins of MeToo, is what has it meant for Indigenous women? Has it changed anything?
It hasn't meant much at all, to be honest. This country is born on sexual assault of Aboriginal women. And that's just trickled down. And with the head hunting and, you know, what was it, the scalps or whatnot, we're talking about everyday people. You know, we go back to colonisation and people wonder, my thing is that, you know, there were missions put in place, right? In those missions there was generally one white man. And yet all the fair-skinned babies were being born. Who did they think were making those fair-skinned babies when there's one man head of the mission? So this culture of sexual assault and abuse has been constant since colonisation for our women. So wanting big headhunters goes right back to there, if that's where you want to start.
Yeah, it's interesting that when one of the things that Jess writes about consistently, that this was a shift in, this wasn't just women telling their stories, not that there's a just about that, but it was also about pointing the finger at the perpetrators and the systems that protect them. So that's then the conversation we need to be having when it comes to, you know, to race and class and everything as well, right?
That's right, and that's what Tarana was doing. Like hers was the grassroots, come out of grassroots, and then all of a sudden a white actress, and it all goes to privilege, like, you know, and then Me Too is this big movement, but it was happening 11 years prior to that on the ground, you know, so that to me says that she's put in all this work and then all of a sudden it's all about, you know, white actresses and white producers, and becomes a white thing and seen through a white lens, and black people, brown people, Indigenous people, Aboriginal women, they're you know, where are they in this lens?
Do you want to talk to that, Jess? Because I know this is something that you've addressed in the book, and I was struck by you saying that Tarana was really worried watching it unfold about what would happen to the women who were telling all these stories. Was there the care for them?
Yeah, that's right. And Ashley's exactly right, you know, that this had been a grassroots collectivist movement. And the thing is that the hashtag MeToo was coincidental, you know, it was a coincidence with Tarana Burke's statement, or the thing that she was using to really galvanise that solidarity, and a very happy coincidence, because I think Tarana Burke gives the movement its soul. But really this was, the framework for Me Too was set by the Weinstein expose. That was the world's sort of exploding moment that kind of ignited this firestorm. And so the celebrity framework and everything that started this, I guess it gave some people a feeling that, well, if those, you know, pretty successful women have been sexually assaulted and they're not ashamed by it, then I don't need to be ashamed by it either. That's part of the power of it. But if we had not had Tarana Burke come in and be acknowledged for her founding, you know, the origins of her work, I think Me Too would have been a flash in the pan, because without that connection to the grassroots, all it really is a movement to expose and disclose, but there's no connection to community in that.
So how do we bring it back
quite isolating
to the grassroots then? How do we bring it back to the grassroots if Ashley's saying it's not really filtering down in that sense? Yeah,
well, that's, you know, to be honest, I spoke to a lot of people about what was anything happening in Australia that was going to make a difference to the lives of women of colour, of, you know, a woman working in a bar or at a remote outstation, and they all said, well, respect at work. is the closest that we have to that, where if women know that their employers actually have a legal obligation to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace, that is a much, much greater protection than they have at the moment, which is virtually nothing. Like, unless you make a complaint.
Complain and see how you go.
Exactly.
Yeah, we'll hope to investigate it. If he says no, or she says no, we have a problem. Now, Samantha Maiden, you've done some really high-profile, impactful reporting on sexual assault in Parliament House. Obviously, you're not an activist, you're a journalist. Do you think that your reporting was received differently because of the MeToo movement, because of the discussions that have preceded it?
Probably. I've never really thought about it through that frame. I did think that something Jess said about the actresses and people thinking, well, if they're not ashamed, why should I be? I thought that there was something powerful in Brittany Higgins' allegations in terms of the fact that she was very articulate, she was very attractive, she was educated, she came from, I don't want to say privileged, but she didn't come from a disadvantaged place. Now, there's all sorts of criticisms you can make of the media highlighting those cases, and in many cases they are legitimate, but there's also power in that story that it started a conversation that hopefully can open the doors to other conversations as well, because I think there was something very visceral in people thinking, well, if that can happen to someone in Parliament House under the Prime Minister's watch, as it were, not suggesting that he knew about it at the time, but in the building, that made people really, really angry. And I think it also made people think not just, well, if that happens to that person, why should I be ashamed? But if that happens to that woman in that place, what protection do I have? And that's why it sparked such an important conversation. And in terms of the grassroots stuff, I mean, I know this is slightly different, but I think the work that Chantel Contos has been doing that grew out of that in relation to consent, communicating with young women on Instagram and social media and the platforms that they use has been really powerful. And so I don't necessarily want to be in the business of getting scalps, but I do like the idea of being in the business of real change and structural reform. And I think that's the power of those stories, is it starts the conversation, that starts people thinking about that. And we'll see more of that in this week when Kate Jenkins hands down her report on the workplace at Parliament House. Yes, it's very narrowly focused, but I think that will trigger more discussions about workplaces generally.
And that's been a big part of it, Parnell, right? It's just the sheer number of conversations, especially between women, on their histories and their pasts. And I remember having one with you on this show right. when it just began, right?
Yeah.
And there was kind of like a mass disclosure. What do you think that has meant?
Look, I think Jess calls it in her essay, and unfortunately I haven't had a chance to read the whole thing, but you use the term cultural revolution, and I think that is precisely how this should be understood. It is part of a change in culture which happens every sort of few decades, and what we're looking at is, once upon a time, women could not go out in public without a chaperone. So they were basically the property of a man. The man was responsible for that woman, and a man always looked after that woman. Then there was the Cultural Revolution, which saw women emancipated from that structure, and all of a sudden they were nobody's responsibility but their own, but there was a certain sort of, well, they became almost fair game to people. And this is where I think, your experience from the Indigenous experience is really important. It's on a different timeline, but essentially Indigenous women were fair game from a colonisation perspective much earlier. Now what we're seeing in terms of the Cultural Revolution is women saying, well, no, you are still accountable for your bad behaviour, but now you're accountable to society. You are accountable to yourselves, to this bigger structure, and we are going to enforce that. And so it's a really important sort of movement like that, but I think we also have to start understanding it as a movement rather than as a personal attack, because we have to bring up boys and we have to explain to them how they fit into this society. You know, great boys are not going to be produced by being told the whole time how terrible men are.
Yeah, Sanjaya, as our bloke on the panel this evening, sorry to go to you exactly on that point. Now, you know, Grace Tame, the Australian of the Year, gave a TED talk on Friday. I was talking to someone afterwards who had watched it and he said, I just feel that Grace was talking straight to me and saying to me, you sit up and I'm only saying this once. He said that there was something about her that kind of like men really respond to, in the sense of we need to take responsibility. Now, this is what Jess is writing about in her essay. She says the MeToo made men sit up and take notice. Do you think that's right?
Look, I do think so, because if you go back a few decades, certainly when I was growing up, you didn't hear about sexual violence. You didn't hear about sexual discrimination. So growing up as a boy, you didn't know what was right or what was wrong when it came to those things. You didn't know what values you should hold. But now we are hearing about it. And we, as men, and certainly as an individual, we're shocked. And it makes us think twice about the way we act and the way we talk when we are with women. So I think it is really good that we are speaking about these issues, and not just related to women, but issues around racism, etc. The Tarana Burke issue is interesting. And look, as a person of colour, growing up, whether it's at the school level, the community level, the national level, international level, I do find that if a cause is taken up with a white person at its head, it's more likely to get mileage. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because the benefits of it can be for everyone, for white people and people of colour. But I think Samantha also talked about some reasons why that might have been the case recently as well.
I was really, I love the quote that you've put in here, Jess. Now, Ashley, I want to ask you a question about that. Muriel Ruxaya, I don't know how to pronounce it.
Ruxaya.
Thank you. Muriel Ruxaya. And she says, what would happen if one woman told the truth about her life? The world would split open. But reflecting on that, because truths can split cultures open, do you feel that Indigenous women have told the truth for a long time and repeatedly, and it hasn't been heard?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I by no means, when I say things through the white lens, do I want any woman of any nationality to be bashed, raped or assaulted. And what Brittany done with the Parliament thing was great. But imagine, just imagine for a minute, if every woman come together and done that when there was an Aboriginal woman death in custody, when an Aboriginal woman goes missing. Imagine if everyone joined arms and made a circle around Parliament House, the shift and the leadership that would lead to, and the somehow equality. Because Aboriginal women aren't considered equal to non-Aboriginal women in this country, and I don't care what anyone says, that they're not. So I think that we've been continually telling the truth, but people listen to respond and don't listen to hear and act, and that's what's happened. And you know, we can't talk about sexual assault or any form of violence against women unless we talk about colonisation and racism that's been perpetrated on Aboriginal women and continues to this day. So the truth telling is there. People are listening now. Like I'm sitting here, so clearly people are listening. But it's still not, in all the spaces where violence sits, there's not one Aboriginal woman that sits at the head of any of those organisations, those big organisations, and that in itself is a problem too.
Do you think it's sometimes about holding the communities that you know to account as well? Because I mean, one of the reasons that Brittany Higgins is holding Parliament House to account is because she was based in Parliament House. One of the reasons that the actresses held Harvey Weinstein to account so prominently was because that was, of course, the world they moved in, and so that was explosive. And so Indigenous women, do you need to hold the people who are perpetrating this violence to account directly?
Absolutely, and we do. We do, but because we're not good victims, we're not believed when we go to the police. When we ring the police, Aboriginal women tend to be treated as the victim and as the perpetrator, not the victim.
Yeah.
So we're up against the upheaval of other issues that non-Aboriginal women aren't, or any woman in Australia isn't, as opposed to Aboriginal women.
And I think that's
There's a double standard whether people want to admit it or not.
And this is the thing: the more precise you are about that, the better you can
I'm
solve
straight
that
up the
sort
middle
of
about
problem.
that.
Well, I think that's partly, I think, what MeToo also did, because it was a movement for accountability. What it also opened up and exposed were the schisms in the feminist movement, and where, especially in Australia, that more like white corporate feminist approach was in the ascendancy. And when MeToo was first really acted upon, it was like any other country around the world where MeToo touched, which was like over 100 different countries. It expressed itself primarily through that corporate feminist lens, because that's what was ascendant in Australia. And because that crashed and burned so spectacularly, it also opened up this whole conversation about, well, like, which women get to talk, and if a woman tells her story, who listens, and what should happen once the truth of her story is known. And if we're talking about power and accountability, what is the power and accountability within the feminist movement to include women from all backgrounds, particularly from the Indigenous background, where there's a lot to say about colonisation and power that is not just a male-female binary. So I think actually MeToo as an accountability movement has gone beyond just the issue of sexual violence and much more to enforcing a culture of accountability across the board.
Yeah, Samantha Maida, in terms of women kind of speaking about their stories, one woman who spoke to you was Bridget Archer, you reported on today, who this week spoke about being effectively herded into a meeting with the Prime Minister, that she was, at a time that she was distressed, at a time that she said that she was not ready to have that meeting. Former MP Julia Banks has described that as a form of coercive control. Do you think that's fair?
Look, I think some of that language, adopting it and putting it straight onto that, can be problematic because in a way it can, I think, undercut and downplay the sort of really violent nature of coercive control in those relationships. And I think we've got to be careful about conflating that entirely and using that language. But in terms of Bridget Archer's account, I spoke to her on Saturday. It was a story that we published over the weekend on news.com.au, and I was really moved by her story because, and I've said this in some other places, in some ways it is a story about an individual moving between three rooms, right? She was in the chamber, she was seen, you know, teary-eyed after she took this brave stand. Some people would say brave, some people would have other words if they didn't agree with her. So she was feeling emotional, right? And then she found herself having a conversation with Josh Frydenberg. You've seen the photographs. He was standing over her. Some people then suggested that he was bullying her, intimidating her in some way. And she said, no, that really wasn't the case. He was actually asking me if I was okay. But it's what happened next is really interesting, because he then says to her, why don't you come to my office and we'll have a talk? And she's like, okay. And then she gets there and he says, well, actually, I really want to take you to the Prime Minister's office. And she's already been fielding these messages from the Prime Minister's office where she's actually saying, you know what, I'm really emotional, not really at my best, totally understand the Prime Minister wants to talk to me, and that's completely reasonable. And I should point out that he did that with Gerard Rennick and other male MPs that you know, were a bit renegade. And then she's kind of then taken to the Prime Minister's office where she's not really comfortable with it. She's in an emotional state. She's told people that she doesn't really want to see him right then, right there. The doors are opened. There's Maurice Payne, the Foreign Minister, sitting there staring at her. She wasn't told she was going to be there either. The Prime Minister and Josh Frydenberg. And I can see that those three individuals, powerful individuals, probably thought that they had the best of intentions, right? I'm not going to put a malevolent frame on it. But if that was an employment meeting, right, you would say to a staff member that they have a right to bring an emotional support person, that they have a right to have that meeting at a time of their choosing. And that's why she then spent the first half of the meeting, you know, crying and apologising. And I think when you lay it out, even though in some ways it's a very straightforward story, I found it devastating listening to how she was sort of moved around. And because she does have a history of child sex abuse, it's difficult not to see it through some ways through the frame of someone who has experienced trauma in their life, not being respected when they say no.
What of the framing of it as it was friendly and supportive and we were caring for her?
Well, I think if the Prime Minister seriously thinks that, and I actually think he does, I think there's a lot of things he doesn't get about human interaction.
Jess, you've thought, written, advocated a lot on coercive control. How do you view this?
Coercive control does operate outside the context of intimate relationships. We see it in cults, in hostage situations, kidnapping. And while some parts of this situation may share elements with it, really what we're looking at more is coercion. But I'm not sure that it's coercive control. I'm sort of on the same page as Sam here in the sense that, you know, coercive control is an all-encompassing, pervasive type of abuse that is a trap that often you don't even know is happening to you, and that you feel like you can't get out of. Now, as far as I can see, Bridget Archer knew exactly what was happening. She called it out, you know, not long after it happened, and she's not putting up with it. I don't see her looking trapped. In fact, I see her as quite a liberated person who's, you know, much in the spirit of MeToo, refusing to keep a man's secrets, refusing to paper over what her instinct is telling her is wrong. And I think it's really telling that she was actually the first female Liberal MP to say that she'd be going to the Women's March. And she talks, I think in Sam's article, she talks about the fact that she has felt, you know, uncomfortable being a member of this government this year. And so at this point where she's probably swallowed down a lot of different things, final straw, she's like, I'm not going to keep your secret. I'm going to tell people how this happened, what happened in that room, that it's different to what you say, and that it's not okay.
Yeah, I think it goes to your point as well. You quote someone towards the end, I think a student advocate, saying this society is absolutely brim full of survivors. A movement like this, when it takes off, is going to have some kind of impact. So well done on your, as usual, forensic work on the matter. Thanks so much, Jess Hill.
Thanks, everyone.